Hey friends, tonight we're slipping into a world that moves without footsteps. A place where silence speaks louder than swords. We're heading back, not just through history, but into the hidden lives that shaped it from the shadows. So before you settle in, take a second to follow or share if you find peace in these quiet tales. And drop a comment with where you're listening from. I always love seeing how far these whispers travel. Now lower the lights, get cozy, maybe let a bit of white noise hum in the background, and let's drift together into a story stitched with silence, patience, and precision. You're probably picturing hoods, daggers, maybe a little rooftop moonlight, just enough to glint off a blade before someone stops breathing. That's cute. But real assassins didn't look like that. They didn't want to be noticed. They wanted to be forgotten. In the ancient world, the best assassin was the one who never looked like one. He was a sandal maker. She was your aunt. Sometimes they were already in the room before anyone realized someone important was about to die. Assassination wasn't about style. It was about timing. People didn't kill kings because it was thrilling. They killed kings because kingdoms were complicated, and sometimes the only way to clean up a political mess was to remove the person still breathing in the middle of it. There were no forensics. No cameras. No sketch artists asking, was the chin more square or oval? If someone died and nobody saw it happen, then it didn't happen. At least not in court. Sometimes it didn't even make it into the official scrolls. History has a soft spot for stories with clean endings. Assassins made sure of that. You could be stabbed in a bathhouse, smothered behind a silk screen, or offered tea that tasted slightly too sweet. That sweetness? Probably powdered aconite. But you'd never know. You'd just feel a bit sleepy. And then you'd stop being a problem. The work didn't attract glory. It attracted ghosts. Assassins didn't sign their names, or boast, or explain their philosophy. They left no manifestos. Only one less heartbeat in a palace. They worked with the rhythm of a disappearing echo, barely heard, already gone. Even the word assassin came later, built from old whispers. Hashishin, they were called, in the hills of Persia. Or maybe they weren't. Maybe that was just a story told by frightened crusaders who couldn't understand how people kept dying so efficiently. There was no job title. No training montage. You didn't apply to become an assassin. Someone noticed that you were quiet and careful and not squeamish about blood. And then one night someone put a purse of coins on your table and asked you to solve a problem that couldn't be solved by law. Sometimes it was personal. Usually it wasn't. You weren't killing someone because you hated them. You were killing them because they were in the way. And you were good at solving that kind of problem with a permanent solution. Assassins didn't carry scrolls. They carried silence. Silence was the weapon. That and patience. No one remembered the waiter who walked in. No one noticed the temple maid leave. But days later someone would ask, "Wait, has anyone seen the governor?" By then, the assassin was gone. Not running. Just gone. Into another city. Another role. Another problem to be erased. The best ones didn't get famous. They got old. Lived out their lives near rivers, or in gardens, or behind shop counters. Because when you're very, very good at killing people, the most radical thing you can do is stop. And so this isn't the story of action. It's the story of absence. The gap between a heartbeat and silence. The moment someone with a name became a memory, and someone else walked away without leaving footprints. Steel is loud. It glints, it sings, it draws attention. But poison? Poison is the weapon of people who want you dead and silent. Preferably in that order. Assassins didn't always come with knives. Sometimes they came with fruit. A little overripe. A little too red. Or wine, poured from the left, because they were right-handed and needed the good hand free to slip something in when no one was watching. In Egypt, they used hemlock. In Rome, it was cyanide from peach pits or powdered lead scraped into honey. In China, there were poisons with names that translated to things like heart-cutting dust or smile sleep. Names that sounded almost beautiful. Death in those cultures wasn't rushed. It was refined. A good poison didn't foam or twitch. It slid in. Quietly. The victim didn't scream. They coughed once, maybe twice, and then sank back into their silk cushions like they just remembered something they'd rather not talk about. If a sword strike was a message, poison was a whisper. You were never safe, it said. Not even here. Because poisons turned your own life against you. The food you trusted. The servant who served it. Even your own stomach betrayed you in the end. The beauty of it was in the aftermath. The confusion. Was it illness? Was it fate? Was it just bad luck that the court's most inconvenient officials suddenly keeled over during dessert? Doctors were consulted. Priests were summoned. Autopsies, if they existed at all, amounted to a priest poking the body and declaring it unclean. People nodded, burned incense, and quietly rearranged the seating chart. And while everyone mourned and speculated, the assassin was probably still in the room, refilling goblets, smiling softly, pouring tea. Not too much. Just enough. The real trick wasn't the substance, it was the timing. Some poisons killed fast, which made them obvious. The good ones took hours, sometimes days. The best ones? You could blame them on a bad oyster or a cold caught at court. Nobody. There were antidotes, sure. But most people didn't know them. That was the point. The knowledge was hoarded, passed down in fragments. Tinctures stored in carved boxes, labeled in dead languages. If you knew what you were doing, you could take a life without even entering the same room. And sometimes you didn't even need to kill. Sometimes the threat was enough. A slice of fruit left uneaten. A goblet untouched. A servant dismissed too quickly. Power made people paranoid, and poison made that fear real. The assassins who used it didn't swagger. They didn't announce. They moved slowly, poured carefully, and waited. Poison teaches you patience. It rewards stillness. It tells you to smile while you're planning someone's last meal. And when the body cools and the crown shifts and everyone in the palace learns to hold their breath before drinking, you've done your job. You haven't just ended a life. You've changed the atmosphere. You've added weight to every sip. Poison wasn't dramatic. It was deliberate. It didn't leave a trail of blood. It left a trail of doubt. And doubt, unlike a blade, tends to linger. Not every job needed subtlety. Sometimes the message had to be sharp, fast, and final. No room for mystery. Just a body on the floor and the right people suddenly sitting up straighter. When poison was too slow and politics too tangled, there was always the knife. Or the garrote. Or the cord tucked into a robe, braided silk that could snap a windpipe clean in two. You didn't walk through the front door with a weapon. That was for amateurs. You brought nothing. The knife was already there, hidden in a chair leg, behind the drapes, inside the hollow of a ceremonial staff. Sometimes you used the target's own letter opener. That was a good day. No one suspects the death tool when it's monogrammed. Assassination up close wasn't elegant. It was fast, but never clean. Real death is messy. It stinks. People kick. They try to speak and forget how. Blood sprays places it shouldn't. But your job wasn't to flinch. It was to finish. Silk cushions muffled the sound. So did thick carpets. The smarter targets died in rooms with walls too thick for eavesdropping. They didn't realize that was also why no one would hear them die. You hid behind folding screens, under tables, inside wardrobes. You learned to breathe like furniture, to slow your heart until it barely counted. Then came the moment, when the sandals clicked across the floor and the voice said something tired or pompous or distracted, and then silence. One step, one cut, one less problem in the world. Sometimes the target recognized you. That was the worst part. The flicker of understanding, like, oh, it's you. Then the second flicker, of course it's you. And by the third, it's already too late. There were rules, if you cared to follow them. Don't kill in temples. Don't strike a sleeping child. Don't miss. Most assassins only followed the third. When the job was done, you left no note. No symbol. That's for plays. Not for professionals. The room stayed as it was, except for the absence of breathing, and the slow puddle under the chair, and maybe a single overturned cup. You didn't linger. You didn't gloat. You walked out as if you'd been dismissed early. People remember loud exits, not quiet ones. The best kills were in places people thought sacred: bedchambers, council halls, private gardens. Not because they were dramatic, but because they were trusted. People let their guard down in those spaces. They unbuckled their armor. They spoke freely. They died quickly. You weren't fast because of training. You were fast because hesitation got you killed. You didn't pray before or after. If gods cared about human politics, the world would be quieter. You weren't an artist. You were a function. Sometimes you cleaned up afterward, moved the body, rearranged the scene to look like a fall or a duel gone wrong. But more often you didn't. Let them find it. Let them feel the aftermath. Because the point wasn't just to end a life. It was to remind the living, someone got close enough. That kind of message stays longer than any blade wound. If you think assassins always hide in shadows, you're missing the point. Sometimes, the best way to disappear is to be impossible to notice. Not hidden behind a mask, but woven into the fabric of everyday life. The real disguise wasn't flashy. It wasn't a painted face or a theatrical costume. It was plausibility. The face of a servant, a merchant, a pilgrim passing through on a slow afternoon. Someone who belonged exactly where they were. In crowded cities, where voices echoed from market stalls and incense blurred the air, No one had the time or patience to study every face twice. That's where assassins thrived. In the blur of faces and footsteps, in the unnoticed moments. They weren't ninjas crouched on rooftops. They were the hand that poured wine, the laundry woman folding silk kimonos, the scribbler taking notes in the corner. If people looked away once, they'd look away twice. Disguise was about patience, not panic. You learn how to walk slowly enough not to draw attention, but not so slowly you seem suspicious. You learn how to answer questions without adding information, and how to smile just enough to be polite but never so much you were remembered. Some assassins carried papers that said they were merchants. Others wore the robes of priests. Some weren't trained killers at all, just trusted faces who learned the art when the price was right. The trick wasn't to blend in. It was to be what no one questioned. The quiet helper. The one who made life easier without needing thanks. A ghost that cleans the room without disturbing the dust. Sometimes the disguise was even simpler, no change at all. Just the right hairstyle, a little dirt on the hands, a nod to the gatekeeper, and the path was clear. When the door closed behind you, the mask came off. The killer stepped forward. The stranger vanished. There was a delicate balance. Be too obvious, and suspicion sticks. Be too cautious, and you invite scrutiny. The best assassins walked it like a tightrope in the dark, steady and unshakable. Decoys worked the same way. Sometimes, the real assassin was the one who never showed up. A servant who looked like someone else, a shadow where a person should be. They sent others to die instead, or left empty beds for the victim's enemies to find. Some killers mastered the art of misdirection so well that when the body was found, no one was sure if it was really the person they'd been hunting. Names changed. Stories twisted. Truth became the loudest lie. This wasn't about trickery for its own sake. It was a tool. Because the world didn't reward people who stood out. It punished them. And assassins? They survived by being the people who never invited punishment. So next time you think of a killer, don't imagine cloaks or masks. Imagine the quiet person who serves your tea without a second glance. The passerby whose eyes never settle. The stranger who leaves no footprints but rearranges the pieces. They're already there. To move unseen, you first have to understand what people see, and what they don't. Assassins didn't just slip through shadows, they shaped the shadows themselves. Their world was one of silence so thick you could hear a leaf fall, and footsteps so soft they erased themselves before hitting the ground. Every step mattered. The wrong step would announce your presence like a drumbeat in a quiet temple. So the first lesson was simple: don't be heard. They learned to walk on the balls of their feet, heels barely touching. Like a cat, but quieter. Sandals were swapped for soft cloth wrappings or no shoes at all when the night was deep enough to hide the bare skin. Stone floors, wooden halls, dirt paths, each demanded its own rhythm. Assassins studied the way others moved, mimicked the innocent shuffle of servants, the confident stride of courtiers, the hurried footsteps of messengers. They learned to move against the flow, never alongside it, because crowds can either hide you or expose you. Knowing which depended on timing. They used the natural noises of the world to their advantage. The chatter of market sellers, the hum of temple prayers, the clatter of rain against roofs. Their passage was masked by the symphony of daily life, slipping between moments no one expected to be important. Sometimes, when a room was too silent, they created distractions, a dropped bowl, a whispered cough, a rustle of silk. Nothing dramatic, just enough to redirect attention long enough to pass unnoticed. Paths were mapped not in streets or alleys but in memories, shortcuts behind gardens, hidden stairways inside walls, secret tunnels known only to a few. These routes weren't on any map. They were invisible lines traced through time and silence. Even when locked gates barred the way, assassins found cracks, loose stones, forgotten keys, bribed guards whose eyes looked but didn't see. Because the best defenses aren't walls, but the confidence they give people to stop watching. Movement wasn't only physical. It was mental. Anticipating when footsteps might echo, when light would catch a shadow just right, when a breath could betray the presence of someone standing too close. Assassins trained their senses beyond seeing and hearing. They felt the vibrations of the floor through thin soles, smelled the subtle change in air when a door opened too quietly, noted the smallest shifts in temperature that hinted at hidden passages. The invisible path is not just the road less traveled. It's the road never noticed at all. You can't chase a ghost because it's always ahead, always one step away, never where you expect it to be. And when the time comes to strike, that silence, those invisible paths, become the final cloak. No one hears you enter, and no one hears you leave. Only the quiet space where life once was, now gone. Assassins didn't just kill, they whispered. In the halls of power, silence was rare, but secrets were currency. Words moved like shadows, soft, quick, and deadly. The court was a place where everyone listened and no one truly spoke. Every phrase had two meanings, every smile hid a dagger, and every glance could shift the balance of power. Assassins learned early that the sharpest weapon wasn't a blade, but a carefully placed word. Information was everything. Who ate with whom, who avoided eye contact, who suddenly changed their routine. Assassins became invisible historians, piecing together alliances and grudges from gossip and hushed conversations. Sometimes they planted rumors. A quiet story told just loud enough to travel down marble corridors, planting doubt where loyalty once lived. They knew that a well-placed whisper could turn friend into foe, and friend's friend into enemy. In court, the smallest hint of suspicion could topple kings, ruin families, or open doors for new players. Assassins used this to their advantage. Before a strike, they'd sow confusion, false accusations, secret meetings rumored but never seen, strange gifts that raised eyebrows. They spoke in riddles, in half-truths, in silences that shouted louder than words. When their name was mentioned, it was always with caution, or not at all. They were ghosts even in conversation. To move through court politics required subtlety. Assassins disguised themselves as servants, scribes, musicians, roles where they could overhear, watch, and influence without drawing attention. They listened to the laughter that didn't reach eyes, the complaints whispered behind closed doors. Sometimes they overheard secrets not meant for their ears. That was their advantage. The weak points in armor, the betrayals waiting to happen. The perfect moment to strike came not just with a blade, but with knowledge. But they never made mistakes. A single misplaced word, a glance held too long, and the entire plot unraveled. Assassins learned to speak softly, to move lightly, to vanish before anyone realized they'd been there. In the court's twisted dance, power changed hands like a flame in the wind, flickering, fragile, easily snuffed. Assassins were the breeze no one noticed until the fire was gone. Their work was not just killing, it was rewriting history in silence. A smile here, a lie there, a whispered warning that never reached its target. These quiet moves shifted kingdoms, but left no trace. So next time you imagine a blade flashing in moonlight, think instead of the silence between words, the pause before a sentence. Because sometimes, the deadliest strike is the one you never hear coming. Masks are more than decoration. They are disguise, protection, identity, and deception all in one. In the world of assassins, masks weren't always literal. Sometimes they were the roles people played, the false smiles, the polite bows, the practiced laughter. Sometimes the mask was a face learned by heart, worn so long it became the only face anyone ever saw. But literal masks existed too. Painted faces of courtiers, shimmering silk that hid scars or intentions, and sometimes simple cloth veils that blurred identity. Behind every mask, an assassin found safety and power. The mask freed them from their past, from expectations. It allowed them to move through crowds without recognition, slipping past guards who never looked twice. It was both shield and weapon. But wearing a mask also meant living in shadows. You never showed the real self. You learned to listen harder, watch closer, because trust was dangerous. Every ally could be an enemy, every friend a mask hiding a knife. Some assassins were masters of many masks. They could be a noble in one moment, a beggar in the next, a wandering monk after that. Their voices changed, their postures shifted, their eyes said something new each time. The mask wasn't just for others, it was for themselves. To survive the world they moved through, they had to forget who they were. To kill without hesitation, they had to believe in the face they wore. Yet behind every mask was a shadow, a hint of doubt, a flicker of fear, a trace of loneliness. The mask separated them from the world and from themselves. Sometimes the mask was so real that the assassin forgot where it ended and they began. The quiet person beneath vanished, replaced by the roles they played. But in those rare moments when the mask slipped, when a flicker of true feeling broke through, it was dangerous for everyone. The assassin became human again, vulnerable and unpredictable. And sometimes, that moment was enough. Enough to turn a killer into a ghost into a story whispered in the dark, and a story into legend. The mask was both prison and freedom. A silent language that said, "I am here, but not really." And that was the greatest power of all. Because in the shadows behind the mask, the true assassin lives. Disappearing isn't about magic or tricks. It's about understanding where the world looks, and where it doesn't. Ancient assassins knew that vanishing wasn't running away. It was becoming invisible in plain sight, folding into the everyday until you ceased to exist as a threat, or even a presence. They moved like water, slipping between cracks, dissolving into crowds and corners. Not because they wore invisibility cloaks, but because they mastered the spaces where people didn't pay attention. Vanishing began long before the act. It was a slow retreat from recognition. The assassin stopped visiting the same tea houses, changed routes to the market, altered habits just enough to confuse any watcher. Sometimes, it meant leaving behind everything, a home, a name, a life, without a goodbye or a trace. But mostly, it meant learning to live where no one looked twice. They watched shadows as carefully as they watched people, knowing that a place's stillness was as telling as its noise. A quiet garden could hide a path out, a forgotten alleyway might be the road to safety. Vanishing was also a lesson in patience. Rushing invites notice. A sudden change draws eyes. The best assassins moved with the seasons, waiting for moments when their absence was just another silence in the background. The art wasn't just about bodies and places. It was mental too. They trained themselves to forget their own scent, their own sounds, their own weight. They became echoes, sometimes remembered, often not. When it was time to vanish, it happened like a breath held and released, a pause in the world's attention. The assassin stepped back, folded into the pattern of everyday life, and was gone. Those left behind searched for footprints, whispers, clues. But the vanished left only questions and empty space. No revenge, no pride, just absence. And sometimes that was the deadliest weapon of all. Assassins rarely worked alone. Their craft demanded alliances as quiet and delicate as the blade they wielded. In a world built on secrets, trust was a rare currency, and often silent. The silent pact wasn't a spoken agreement, nor was it carved into stone. It was a nod behind closed doors, a glance exchanged across crowded rooms, a promise carried without words. It bound people who knew that the wrong word could unravel everything. These pacts were fragile, built on necessity, sealed with understanding. Partners in shadow moved like echoes of one another, anticipating without speaking, covering weaknesses, sharing dangers. Sometimes the pact was between killer and informant, a merchant who slipped whispered rumors, a servant who left doors unlocked, a stranger who carried messages without question. Their loyalty was bought, traded, or earned through fear and respect. Other times, the pact was between assassin and ally, another shadow who watched your back, who disappeared with you when the night turned cold and sharp. But silence was the rule. Even among allies, words were a risk. A careless phrase could draw eyes, expose secrets, or bring ruin. This made the pact deeper than friendship. It was a bond forged in shadows, where actions spoke louder than promises and silence was the loudest command. Breaking the pact wasn't an option. The cost was death, not just for the traitor, but for anyone linked by the chain. The trust had to be absolute, or it didn't exist at all. Assassins learned to read these pacts like texts written in shadows. A hesitation, a glance, a subtle gesture could mean everything. It was a language beyond words, a silent dance where one wrong step could end the game. Sometimes, the most dangerous enemy wasn't the target, but the one who broke the pact. In this world of whispered deals and quiet betrayals, the silent pact was the lifeline, and the noose. The assassin who mastered silence outside the blade was the one who survived longest. Because in the end, it wasn't just about killing. It was about knowing who to trust, when to move, and when to vanish. Every life ends somewhere, but for an assassin, death is rarely simple. It is not a fading into darkness, but the final act in a life spent weaving through shadows. The final breath is quiet, like everything else. No grand gestures, no dramatic goodbyes. Just a moment where the world holds still, and then moves on without you. Assassins knew this better than most. They lived with the weight of countless secrets, and the sharp edge of danger at their backs. They accepted that their story might end with a blade, someone else's or their own, but it was never about the death. It was about the life before it. The greatest assassins mastered the art of departure as much as arrival. Knowing when to strike was as crucial as knowing when to vanish. When to hold still, when to act, and when to surrender. They learned to cherish the silence that followed their final move, the stillness after the chaos, the calm after the storm. In those moments, their lives became legends whispered in hidden corners, stories told in half-truths, shadows passed between generations. But even in death, an assassin's work was not done. The ripples of their final breath spread wide, shaping futures, toppling empires, and rewriting history in the silence left behind. Sometimes their death was a warning, sometimes a promise, sometimes simply a question mark in a world that demanded answers. The final breath was the last silence they commanded, a moment of control in a life ruled by uncertainty. They didn't fear it. They embraced it. Because it was the one secret no one could steal. And when the last breath left their lips, the assassin vanished once more, this time, forever.